So as we've mentioned, the entire chapter 7 represents a pause in the events which John began to describe in chapter 6. The angel that appears in verse 3 of this passage commands that the judgment to come is to be stayed until the 144,000 Hebrew evangelists are sealed. This further indicates that while the apostle John records the vision of the 4 angels riding horses in chapter 6, the events in chapter 7 are to occur before the judgment commences. This appears to indicate that the timeline of events includes a brief period of inactivity before the pronounced judgments of the Great Tribulation begin. The 4 angels mentioned in verse 1 who are holding the winds, that they should not blow, are not the same as those seen riding the 4 horses in Revelation chapter 6, verses 2 through 8. The evidence of this we find in verses 2 and 3, where another single angel appears and calls out specifically to these 4 angels not to hurt the earth, the sea, or the trees. Furthermore, the 4 angels in chapter 6 are sent as judgments against the state of mankind directly, whereas the 4 angels of Revelation chapter 7 verses 1 through 3 are sent as judgments against the earth itself. And as we have seen, at this time, they are restrained. Now, beginning in verse 4 and continuing through verse 8, we have an accounting of the 144,000 Hebrew evangelists who will be sent out to spread the gospel throughout the world. And the 12 tribes present are named. And if we take a careful look at these 12 tribes, we'll notice that there's a slight difference between the 12 tribes named here and the 12 tribes found in Genesis chapter 49. And the answer to that discrepancy can be found both in the description of Dan in Genesis chapter 49, where we learn that Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel, but that also he shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that the rider shall fall backwards. Dan will always be a stumbling block. No matter what Dan does, Dan is always going to be creating turmoil. He's always going to be causing the tribes of Israel to trip up. And as we read through the Old Testament, we find that the tribe of Dan is continually falling into sin, continually falling into idolatry. And we do learn in Ezekiel chapter 47 that when Israel returns from the Babylonian captivity, the 70-year captivity, that at that time Joseph, who only had one part in the inheritance because he was a single tribe, now would have 2 parts in the inheritance. That is, he would now be representing 2 tribes. And we do learn when we compare the 2 from Genesis 49 and from Revelation chapter 7, verses 4 through 8, that Dan does not appear in Revelation, but Manasseh does. And the reason why Manasseh does and Dan doesn't is this double portion. Manasseh is a son of Joseph, and Manasseh is given an inheritance in place of Dan, who has been removed. We see a parallel here. We see there were 12 apostles of the Lamb, and all 12 were chosen, all 12 were brought in, although one was dishonest. One eventually would have Satan enter into him, and one would betray his master, Judas Iscariot. He would be removed. He would be cut off. He would die without God, and would be replaced by another whom God himself chose, Saul, who was called Paul, the 12th, the last apostle. The same thing happened with the 12 tribes of Israel. Dan, for very much the same reason, was cut off and was replaced by another 12th tribe who God himself had chosen. In this case, it was Manasseh, a son of Joseph. and that is the complete 12 tribes of Israel mentioned in Revelation chapter 7. That's why I feel very strongly that the 24 elders that are represented in the book of Revelation are these 12 patriarchs of the 12 tribes mentioned in chapter 7, verses 4 through 8, and the 12 apostles of the Lamb, including, of course, the apostle Paul, and discounting Judas Iscariot, who lost his estate when he betrayed his Lord.